country's national anthem says a lot about it, doesn't it? America's national anthem is all about freedom. England's national anthem, and by extension the UK, is all about His Majesty. Poland's national anthem is all about We Save Homeland. Israel's national anthem is all about 2,000 years of hope. Romania's national anthem is all about patriotism and glorious ancestry. But the Welsh national anthem, this is about our warrior poets and their language. But where does this tradition come from? So who was the first Welsh poet? I'm Benjamin, and that's what this video is about. Let's dive in. William Shakespeare of the 16th and early 17th century is considered by many to be England's national poet. But this in a Welsh context. The dramas and plays aside, the poetry of William Shakespeare would be just about average, because our tradition extends so far back in time and has so many rules and motifs and themes that you learn. His rhyming at the end of words was just, well, we rhyme at the inside of words and at the end of words with alliteration stacked on top. Methods of writing poetry, part of a tradition, a way of doing things. But this way of doing things grew over a long time. Over 1,200 years, probably, by the time that Shakespeare came around. You had the poets of the gentry, the poets of the princes and the kings, and before that, the Cynferth, the early poets. And that's what we're going into here. Where did their tradition come from? Who was the first? These poets in the age before the year 1100 wrote hen gerdd, the old poetry, in Hen Ogledd, the Old North, northern England, southern Scotland, that area. But when did it begin? That's our question. And who was the first Welsh poet of this tradition of poetry? To find a date when such a man lived, we need to understand first that Brythonic, or the British language, was not the same language as Welsh or even Old Welsh was. This was breaking up, and Latin was the language of the prestige and learned class. Religious men spoke Latin. Men around Roman camps that had taken off and gone, they still spoke Latin. The Romanized cities of the southeast, heavily Latinized, and there must have been some kind of competition between what many would see as a patois, this Welsh, emerging out of it, this British language. And yet, Cornish Welsh and what would be Breton were still one language. But this was breaking up. It had dialects, clearly, already. And for someone to choose to write poetry in this, for nobles, courtmen, kings, princes, that would take a bit of shunning tradition in some senses, even though you would take the motifs and themes of the old Brythonic way of poetry, whatever that was. At some point, with Old Welsh still forming, and rules for writing poetry in this new language unclear, fusing the Old British and Latin, someone must have stood up and dared to sing conservative praise poetry to warrior kings in this new language without anyone having done it before, since before some time in the 5th century, it would have been unthinkable to sing poetry in this lower class patois that was neither suitable for the empire, nor suitable in comparison to the British kings that had been before the empire. This was new. The old British language would have kept any tradition, so who was it to first break convention and sing poetry in this language, and not the old British language this poetic tradition praising in song would have come from, nor the Latin of the Church and Empire? we have 5 names of poets who have come down to us from some point between the late 5th century and the early 7th century, is my guess, the span of these 5 poets. Let's look at the names of these and who they were now. Aneurin. He wrote a Gododin, Britain's oldest surviving work in a native British language, which is a series of elegies to the men of the kingdom of Gododin, around the area of Edinburgh in Scotland, who took up a suicidal death mission to ride to battle against a vastly larger enemy. The poetry is early, archaic, and has clear influence and conventions from the older British language. And the name Aneurin itself, Nar, means Lord, and has a direct cognate in Irish. But the beginning and end are additions to this. A is probably the word the, either an or a, depending on where it was in the spectrum of the British languages. And in probably denotes a diminutive, small. Maybe this name meant the lordly lad, the noble young man, potentially. Or maybe he was small in stature. We don't know. We also have Taliesin, who was a court poet in both Powys and Rheged in the north, as well as Elfed around Leeds. We have 12 poems by him thought to be from the late 6th century, to do with war, shape-shifting, religion, and nature. Given his texts were so varied and wide in geography, from battles in the Old North, Rhenoglev, to the fertile kingdom of Powys, which at that time included much of England. For this, poets over the next few centuries tagged the name Taliesin onto poetry, hoping that it would survive by being attached to such a notable name. This was very common across Europe at the time. If you couldn't get your poetry to survive past your life, well, why don't you just say it was written by someone greater than you? At least your words will endure. Up to 270 poems are such, and he began to be thought of as the founder of our poetic tradition. Some poets in the later Middle Ages called him Tad, or Father, which matters for later, but mostly these poems can be grouped under the name Taliesin ben Beirdd. Taliesin ben Beirdd. Taliesin, head of poets, or chief of poets. Another 175 earlier poems carry some kind of relationship with this man in legend. But his name means radiant shining brow, tall brow, yesin. And that second word in that, yesin, could have a sense of youthful beauty to its meaning. And that could mean Taliesin was younger than others. Maybe. Poets' names were not usually their native names. They acquired a name depending upon the traits of their poetry and their career. We also have a poet named Cian, about which we really know nothing more than his name, which itself is troublesome because Cian, in older Welsh, this would mean a runty little puppy, maybe a young, scrappy lad, or if he had Irish ancestry, it spoke of someone being old and ancient and wise. Young or old, which one could he be? We don't know. We have another 6th century poet about whom we know nothing but his name as well, Bluchfarth. Bluchfarth. And this is an unusual name for us today in Welsh. This would be poet of a box, like you fold up and put away. Back then this would have meant poet of an enclosed space, because singing poetry was not always something you did inside. You sang before the army as it went to battle. You sang at open-air ceremonies and such. Singing inside would have been rather purpose-driven for some situation. Maybe it could be that he competed in Ymryson, poetic competitions. We don't know, but it does have that tink to it in my mind. Yet he also went by the name Gwyneth Gwawd, grain or wheat of praise and song, suggesting that poetry itself was something that you consumed and lived off of. It nourished, but again, we know nothing about him. We do have a fifth one, a fifth poet, however, about whom we know very little, but his name is a bit different. Tolhairon Tadawan, Ironbrow, father of poetic muse. Tolhairon Tadawan, Ironbrow, father of poetic muse. And whilst that's not much to go on, there are a couple clues in his name about what these words mean in the poetic tradition themselves. Hairon, or iron, is a motif used across the centuries for rulers, kings, and princes. There is authority here. We have a mature, late middle-aged man type in the epithet of Tolhairon. It's not a name that you would give a young poet competing against others for royal patronage. By the way, I asked your patronage. Help me on Patreon, donate, buy me a coffee, I'll put links down below, and let's get back to the video. The second element, Tadawan, means father of poetic muse. Tad is not used very often in the poetic tradition referring to other poets, and when it is, in every other case that I can think of, it is of younger poets addressing a teacher of some kind. This is clear to me that he is considered older by someone, but considered older by whom? But what more do we have to go on other than names of this man? What more is written about him? We have a fleeting glimpse in a couple mentionings here. A Welsh monk in the 9th century, possibly around the year 828, wrote Historia Brythonum, the history of the Britons. Whilst a lot of the work is mythological history, and we must bear that in mind, of the Kinverth, or early poets, it says, at that time, he's talking about a King Aedin here of the Old North in the 6th century, of where we are unsure, who was fighting King Ida of Bernicia. At that time, Tolhairon Tadawan was renowned in poetry, and Nerin, and Taliesin and Bluchvarth, and Cian, who was also called Gwyneth Gwawd, together at the same time were renowned in British poetry. We also have a poem by Taliesin, Angar Cyfundawr, which means hostile confederacy or unloving confederacy. He writes in this poem two things which give us a glimpse. He writes, Cerdwn diw y sydd, trwy iaith Tolhairon, bedydd farn, a farnwys teithi angerdd Brythonic, meaning, it is God's minstrel through the language of Taliesin, baptism of the diviner of judgment, who judged the proper qualities of the passion craft of poetry, from some time, possibly in the late 6th century. He writes as well, Tolhairon a sydd mwyaf a sywedydd. It is Tolhairon, the greatest of learned men. So amongst these 5 poets that we have, what can we deduce from the scant information that we have about who is the oldest? Who did our poetic tradition begin with? The youngest, I would say, is Taliesin, for a few reasons, actually. His name, first of all, does have a tink of youth to it, and if he's emulating another poet, Tolhairon, having Tal as well suggests some type of continuation, someone he learned from, perhaps. Yesin has a youth nuance in its name. But also I've read his poetry and it does feel younger than Anerin's. It is easier to read, though we know scribes transmitted it down making slight changes so it was easier for people to read. Maybe that's why. He's clearly not as old as some of the other poets, in my opinion, maybe even an entire generation younger or closer to us. And the scope of his poetry, Taliesin, is wider than Anerin's, not just elegies. We have religion, warrior poetry, legendary shape-shifting type stuff going on here. This suggests he is closer to us in some way, and more likely, works closer to us were more likely to survive. So I put him as the youngest of these poets. Next, I put these 3 together for a couple reasons. Well, first, Aneurin, his poetry is more archaic than Taliesin's. The Gododin is, there's clearly older conventions going on here. He's expressing just further back in time in the development of the Welsh language, and that suggests being older than Taliesin. But these two other poets, Blwchfardd, his name, suggests that he was competing with other poets indoors. Cian, we don't really know much about him, but poets usually arise in groups because they feed off of each other. So I think these emerged within a group of poets, some of which we would have lost by now. But who did they learn this craft from? I think they learned from Tadawan, Talhairn Tadawan, the father figure in their poetry. So perhaps he was the one that established some type of school, teaching these people, a later graduate, who took upon the mantle. We know that Talhairn and Aneurin competed with each other at some point. It appears so. But that Aneurin lost, and Talhairn was victorious. Maybe a pupil trying to compete with his master and getting smacked down for his arrogance. But who taught Talhairn Tadawan this craft? If he set up a school from which these other poets learned, I don't think he would have been the first to have broken convention. There must have been someone before him, but how much earlier could we have gone and have this Welsh language that was emerging still make sense? Because the language was shifting out of Brythonic under heavy influence of Latin. I don't think earlier than the year 450 this could have even been achieved. The language was progressively more and more Latin until the break with the Roman Empire was certainly formalized in their minds. It took a generation for them to even accept this, and even then they were calling back to Rome, please come back. Sometime between 450 and 500, I think, someone would have taught who had rebelled against this archaic, by that point, Brythonic British language, and said, we're going to dare to use this patois. It's better than turning to Latin and abandoning our own heritage entirely. So let's do this. Talhairn would have come in the generation after, around the year 500 or shortly after that. And then Taliesin, when he was an old man, I think. The 550s, 560s. Later even, perhaps. What do you think? Let me know down in the comments. Watch this video.